In this lecture, we're going to introduce the lymphatic system, looking at what lymph is and how it flows and the pathways that it takes to get through the body. So, the lymphatic system is a system of vessels. They very closely resemble veins that move excess fluid from the interstitial spaces in the peripheral tissues and brings that fluid back to the bloodstream. And it moves close to a gallon of fluid a day, somewhere around 3.6 liters of fluid each day. And recall from the cardiovascular system that this is the excess fluid that is not drawn back into the capillaries. So we're talking about fluid out in the peripheral tissues that doesn't make it back into the capillary networks and would otherwise cause edema if it were allowed to remain out there in the peripheral tissues. It also has a secondary function of bringing fats from the digestive system into the venous blood supply. Excuse me. Out in the digestive, around the intestines of the digestive system, there are specialized lymphatic capillaries called lacteals. These lacteals gather the fats that we have digested out of the food that we eat, and then those fats move through the lymphatic system and back into the bloodstream. And then finally, we associate with the lymphatic system the functions of immunity, the ability to recognize foreign particles or microbial cells, and also cells that have become virus infected or perhaps have gone cancerous, and to remove those cells from the body and destroy them. So immunity is also associated with the lymphatic system. So lymphatic flow begins in these little closed-end tubes that are found in the peripheral tissues called lymphatic capillaries. And they are formed just like regular blood capillaries are, of endothelium, a simple squamous epithelium, and they look a lot like blood capillaries. But the way that the cells overlap each other out there at the beginnings of these lymphatic pathways forms little one-way valves. So here is a cell, and notice how they kind of overlap, and that gives us space for tissue pressure, so for hydrostatic pressure out here in the tissues, to be able to force fluid into the capillary. And there are also these little protein fibers here that are anchored to both to the cells and to the peripheral tissues out there that hold the lymphatic capillary open, and so that prevents all of the tissue pressure, the hydrostatic pressure there in the tissues, from causing the lymphatic capillaries to collapse. And so as this excess lymphatic fluid moves from the tissues into the lymphatic capillaries, it forms the fluid that we refer to as lymph. So out here around this capillary network, we see the lymphatic capillaries that are collecting excess fluid, and notice that they all join together to form the lymphatic pathways that are going to then carry this fluid back toward the venous system. So lymphatic capillaries then merge into larger and larger vessels, the lymphatic vessels, and they have a construction very similar to what we see in veins in the body, including the one-way valves that are found in the pathways of the larger veins. We see those also in the pathways of these larger lymphatic vessels. The lymphatic vessels then lead toward little clusters of lymph nodes, and if we take a look here in this image of the woman, you can see we've got the lymphatic vessels that are bringing, say, fluids up from the legs, eventually they reach these regions where there are a series of lymph nodes, and the fluid passes through the lymph nodes and then continues on into the larger lymphatic trunks of the body. There are a number of lymphatic trunks. There are some in the lower back area, so those are that's the lumbar trunk, and it receives blood from the lower. Here we can see the lumbar trunk. It receives blood from lymph from the lower limbs, from the abdominal wall, and from the organs down in the pelvic region. So that is where all of the lower extremities lymph collects into the lumbar trunk. The intestinal trunk receives the lymph from the abdominal organs, the viscera there in the abdomen, including all the lacteals that are bringing fats from the intestines. The intercostal trunk and the bronchomediastinal trunk, these receive lymph from the thorax, from the thoracic regions. The subclavian trunks receive lymph from the arms, and then the jugular trunks receive lymph coming from the head and the neck. So a number of different trunks in the body that collect the lymph that is coming from out in the peripheral tissues. And then the lymph is then shuttled into two collecting ducts. There's the thoracic duct, which is the largest of the two collecting ducts. So here's the thoracic duct here. And it receives the lymph that's coming from the lower limbs and from the left side of the body. So all of the lymph that is being received from the legs, from the abdominal areas, everything below the diaphragm here, from the left thoracic cavity, from the left arm, and from the left head and neck, all come into the thoracic trunk, and it brings the lymph up and returns it at the left subclavian vein. The right lymphatic duct, then, if we look at the body here, it drains all of the body that you see is kind of stained red here. So that's the right arm, the right head and neck, and the right thorax, and it all delivers blood to the right lymphatic duct and then returns the blood at the right subclavian vein. And we can see if this is a woman, then there's a lot of lymphatics associated with the breast tissue as well. So everything from the left breast is going to be returned at the right breast is going to be returned at the right subclavian vein there at the right lymphatic duct. Okay, so those are the primary pathways. How do we get fluid, the lymph, to move through the lymphatic vessels? Well, let's take a look. First, it's blood pressure that filters all of, and this is a reminder now of what we looked at in the last chapter, but if you recall, blood pressure pushes fluid out, osmotic pressure draws fluid back in, but because there is less osmotic pressure pulling fluid in, there's a buildup of tissues out in the peripheral system. That buildup of fluid causes hydrostatic pressure that pushes the fluid into the lymphatic capillaries. And so what is lymph? Well, it's very similar to blood plasma. It's got water, it's got nutrients and dissolved gases, it's got hormones, it's got waste materials, it's got everything that blood plasma has in it, with the exception of the large plasma proteins. Those, of course, are retained in the blood, and what gives blood its osmotic pressure. And because it's out there, in the tissues, it will also carry anything else, any of the foreign materials or any of the waste products that might be in that tissue fluid as well. So bacteria, viruses, any toxins that are being made by invaders, other cellular debris, all of that stuff is going to be in the lymph as well. And so as lymph is flowing through the larger vessels, it flows by the exact same mechanisms that forces venous blood to flow. So we have skeletal muscle that squeezes on the walls of the lymphatic vessels. So here's a lymphatic vessel, squeezes on the walls, that pushes blood away from these, you can kind of make out the outline here of the one-way valves that are found in the lymphatic system. So just like we saw in veins, we have these one-way valves, and as skeletal muscle squeezes against this section, it forces lymph up, and as skeletal muscle squeezes against this section and lymph is forced backwards, that closes, it comes in behind these valves and closes those flaps. So skeletal muscle and these one-way valves are involved, and so are the pressure changes that are associated with breathing. So as lymph is drawn into especially the thoracic duct, then and as we're breathing, then the same forces that came into play to move blood via the respiratory pump will also help to move the fluids of lymph. So as we, I'll just draw a quick drawing. So here's the diaphragm, here's the lymphatic duct, or the thoracic duct. As we breathe in, the diaphragm flattens, that pressurizes this portion of the lymphatic duct and forces fluid upwards, and the lower pressure here pulls open the lymphatic trunk. That makes it easier to draw that fluid upward. As we breathe out, diaphragm bellies upward, and that adds even more pressure here at the top to force the lymph up toward the subclavian veins. And this then draws the fluid, the lymph, into this portion of the thoracic duct. So it's this constant back and forth that we talked about with venous blood flow of the respiratory pump, then that helps to draw fluid into the thoracic duct and then push it on upward. And the same effects are happening in all the other lymphatic vessels that are leading into the thoracic duct. So any interference in the flow of lymph can result in what is referred to as lymphedema, or accumulation of interstitial fluid back there at the tissues and swelling in the peripheral tissues. And this can be caused by any blockages in lymphatic pathways or by the removal of lymph nodes and lymphatic vessels that is a part of many cancer treatments. So lymphectomies will, removal of lymph nodes will change lymphatic flow and can lead to this lymphedema. All right, so that's everything I have to say at this point about the movement of lymph through the body. So look for the next video coming soon.